really want to talk about in terms of combat, because one of the things that I've noticed out of World War II, some kids at Georgia State were talking to veterans out of World War II, and I don't know how they got my name, but I went down one day to sit down and talk to this young lady who was doing a paper, and apparently this whole class had rounded up World War II veterans, and they were going to talk to them about what had happened to them. And I was sitting there, sort of recounting some of the things that I'm talking about tonight, and there was a Vietnam veteran sitting, maybe 2 tables away. And I said, the one thing that you may notice out of World War II, and I really mean this, rarely do I ever hear World War II people talk about killing anybody. They'll tell you all about how rough things got, but they rarely will tell you that I did this or I did that. And this young man came over and he said he had been in Vietnam, and he said, he said, I have nightmares over the women and the children and all these folks that we killed. And for one reason or another, as I say, I don't know why, I didn't doubt what the young man was saying, but I don't believe that many GIs out of World War II had that many memories or that many nightmares, if you want to call it that. When I say that, there was also a study done, by the way, by the Veterans Administration about 10 or 12 or 15 years after World War II, and it had to do with who was drawing compensation for psychiatric problems resulting from combat duty or service in World War II. And what they found out was that in the infantry itself, less than 0.1% of the people who carry rifles have ever suffered from any psychiatric problems as a result of World War II. Let me tell you who was collecting money for psychiatric problems. People who had gone into service and they could not live in a barracks with 40 other guys. They couldn't shower with 40 guys. They simply could not live in a herd-type existence. But there was another element in there that's really important, and Lord knows I'm not taking any credit away. If you know that your situation is not going to change, I've come to the conclusion that the human body and the human mind can accept anything in the world and adjust to it if you're forced to do it. The people who had the greatest problem, well, in the South Pacific, once you took an island, once you secured that island, then you had maybe a month and a half, or 2 months before you jump to the next island, and you can't do that. Once you take somebody out of a situation that's deadly and dangerous, and let them be peaceful for a while, and then tell them you're going to go back and do it again, then they have all kind of problems. The other people that had problems were the bomber crews. Maybe Paul ran into this because he did some stories on the 8th Army. The individuals who, in England, they had everything in the world. They might as well have been back home. I mean, in terms of officers' clubs and NCO clubs, and they could go to British pubs, they could go to town, they could date girls. In fact, they chased girls all over England. No question about that. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, somebody would wake them up, and they would go. You didn't mind me saying that, did you? They would go into a briefing room, and somebody said, we're going to Schweinfurt today, or we're going someplace. And then they would go on a mission. Maybe they would come under fire as soon as they crossed over the coast. By the time they got to the target, at least there was 2 or 3 or 4 minutes that it was sheer hell. They didn't know whether they were going to live or die. And then they would come back home, and suddenly it was peaceful. Sent into Normandy, that the rifle platoons out of the 1st Division, 4th Division, 5th, 9th, you name all the divisions that were in action, their rifle platoons had suffered something like 90% casualties in the first. So our replacements were coming in daily. And for the most part, the rifle platoons were operating with maybe 20, 25, 28, 20, or 30 people in them, rather than, I can't recall a time when we were full strength. From the time we went ashore, at least until I got hit, for the most part we had maybe, as I said, 30 people in a platoon, rather than the 41 that Teal called for, and rifle companies were way down. We got replacements in August that had not been in the Army on June 6th. They had gotten like a 5-week basic and been shipped into Europe, and they came to us, and let me tell you, some of them didn't know the butt end of an M1 from the muzzle. They hadn't had that much training, but we needed them badly, so we got them during that period of time. So when I was in a hospital, first time I was hit, I was in a field hospital. They came through. I'd been there about 9 days, and they were going to move the hospital. And in all honesty, they were giving you your choice. If you didn't want to make the choice, you could go back to your unit, or you could go back to England for more treatment, or if you didn't want to make that decision, honest to God, the doctors were flipping coins. And if you lost the flip, you went back to your company. And if you won, you went back to England. I'm talking about borderline people who were wounded, because I went back up front with people who had, rounds in their legs that wasn't in a part of their leg that would hurt. And they never had been dug out, and they went right back to combat. And in my case, they put what they call a medical bridge on my shoulder and just pulled it together. And they said, "Well, go back to battalion A and get them to change it every once in a while." So maybe once a week I'd go back to battalion, they'd put a new dressing on. And the only bad thing about it is where your straps came across your shoulder, you could get a little bit sore. And I wasn't an exception, so don't let me paint myself as being different than other individuals, because there were many people who hurt much worse who still went back and served in their companies. In fact, many of the men, when I'm talking about that 10% who did the work that had to be done, my first platoon sergeant, somewhere around down below St. Lo, he took a round one evening about 5 o'clock. He got hit right in the face, and it took out most of his face, or most of his cheekbone, and he went back to battalion, and the next morning he was back up with nothing but a bandage on his face. And then he was sitting there talking to us. And the fact that we had lost a couple of people overnight, he literally was almost crying over the fact that he felt that if he had been there, we would not, I'm talking about people who got killed, that somehow or other he had been able to use the platoon in such a way that we would not lost those people. So as I said earlier when I started out, that there was a camaraderie or something builds up between men in combat, it's almost impossible to explain it. But you do get to the point where you want to take care of everybody that you consider a part of your organization. My luck ran out, if I can say it, on the 10th of October, so I've got an anniversary coming up on Monday, 10th of October 1944, and I have to tell you a little bit about how we got into the situation. We were pushing through the Siegfried line at the time. We were carrying 8 and 16-pound charges of TNT to blow out pillboxes that we had to blow out, and we had jumped off on the 2nd of October. We did not know why, but we lost 10 or 12 2nd Armored Division tanks in the space of about 30 minutes. We did not know how they were being taken out. We knew they were being hit, but we were not encountering flat trajectory.
It's kerosene.
Sometimes from anti-tank weapons, and we did not know at the time how we were releasing them, but I can tell you we learned. But anyhow, on the evening of the 9th, we had been we'd been operating through some villages and everything, or through some communities, and A Company, my company, was detached from the 1st Battalion, and we were told that we were moving really in a southeasterly direction. We were going to hit the edge of this town. I can't remember the name of the town right now. Pass through it, attack up a road to a little crossroads called Burke, Germany. Well, we passed through the 117th Regiment, A Company of the 117th. And if you know GIs, our first question is, how come you guys aren't doing this? We don't need to go up this. We don't need to go up this road. Didn't do us much good. We went up the road anyhow. And we got, I said, I don't know, maybe it was a mile from where we had passed through the 117th, and where this crossroads was going to be. Maybe we were about halfway there when we first came under fire, tank fire. They came down the road, so my platoon was in the lead on the right side. Rex Edmonds' platoon was on the left. Whichcoulter had the platoon behind us. We dropped off, and when I say I'm talking about platoon sergeants, because at that time we had a company commander and the exec officer. We did not have any platoon leaders. If I go back over the about 5 months that I was in combat, I would tell you that at least 3 of those months, the company was basically run by non-coms, other than maybe a company commander or an exec officer, because we lost platoon leaders pretty often. They didn't last too long. But anyhow, we peeled off, and my platoon moved into an orchard-like, and there was a fence line across us and then down. Rex's platoon on the left-hand side was catching most of the tank fire that was coming down the road. Later on, the regimental history said there were 5 tanks and 22 half-tracks that had jumped on an infantry company. And so I don't have to tell you that it got costly before the evening was over. But my platoon guy was up in the corner of the fence, and he called me up to the corner. He said, I want you to see something. And there was a road coming out of Aachen, Germany. and these half-tracks were coming up the road, and we were watching them turn off the road. And they were turning off the road, and they were coming down parallel to us, and you all know what a flanking movement is. Well, when they maybe were 100 yards away from us as they came down alongside us, and then they all flanked in one movement, and they opened up with 20s against our position. And by that time, we had already ordered everybody to put AP in rifles. I don't know if you all know about it or not, but you could knock out a half-track with an armored piercing round from an M1. And we had done it back in Normandy a number of times. So we were going to let them get reasonably close to us, and then we're going to see how many of them we could take out. Now, I don't think we would have won that fight, but damn it, we were going to try to hang on. Our artillery observer that was with us, he took a 20. He lost his nose to a 20. And I don't blame him. He dropped his maps, radios, and everything else, and he took off. And our company commander, God forgive me, he was one of the only Corps officers that we had. He apparently didn't know how to read a map, because, you know, many times we worked out pre-designated fire areas before we attacked. And that afternoon it would have been hard to do it. But even though he raised artillery, we needed the artillery on the half-tracks, and he was trying to direct artillery, and it was hitting on the other side of the road. So it wasn't doing us, you know, any good at all. The half-tracks continued to move in on us, and they were setting haystacks on fire behind us. So as soon as you got up, we were silhouetted. And we were taking, as I said, a good number of casualties. So finally it became inevitable that there was no way we could hold on to it. And we started to pull out. And that's the closest I've ever seen to panic in combat. But within a short length of time, I think, for the most part, we had everything under control. But all of our third platoon, literally our whole third platoon was lost. About 3 people survived out of our third platoon. And I had gone in with about 30, maybe 30, 31 or 32 people, came out with about 14 or 15. In fact, what I'm really telling you is that about when we finally got out of the fight and pulled back enough to get things secure, we started reorganizing. We had a little more than a reinforcement platoon. We might have had 55 or 60 people. So about 4 o'clock in the morning, we moved northward then, or a northwestern direction, behind about 2 miles behind the railroad embankment, and then at sunup we attacked into this town itself, caught every one of the Germans sound asleep, did not fire a single round in taking that little town. But what we did, 2 things. We captured, and I don't know how to pronounce this, P-U-P-C-H-E-N, Püppchen. Now, what we saw, the Germans had taken their 88, their bazooka. They had cut it off. They had put a breech block on the back of it. They had mounted it on an artillery truss like with bicycle wheels, had split trails, a seat on the left side, and the side graduated for 1,200 yards. And we found out before the day was over that at 1,200 yards it wasn't worth a darn. But let me tell you, it was hell on tanks about 300 yards away. But most of the tanks that we took out that day, we were really taken out with German equipment. We captured 4. Somebody had put a thermite grenade in the breech of 1, so we lost it. And we really just distributed 1 to each of the rifle platoons, in addition to our own weapons that we had, plus the artillery that was going to be backing us up. So that was the situation about 7 o'clock in the morning on the 10th. And I had an outpost on a ridge line up in front of this roadway where we were basically dug in. And I don't know, it must have been about 7:15 or 7:30. It was in a wheat field, and the wheat was about this high, and there was a sort of a draw that went away from us, and then there was another city, Jülich, Germany, I believe. And there was a sunken road, and there were about 5 German tanks sitting on this sunken road, and there was a pillbox. And I'm sitting there, and just a few minutes later, a colonel, a full colonel, bird colonel, and a major, and I don't remember whether it was the master sergeant or who was with him at the time, but he was our new battalion, regimental commander, which I did not know at the time, but he introduced himself. Colonel Perdue, who had been our regimental commander, had been promoted to 1-star assistant division commander, so we had a new colonel. So anyhow, he came up to the top of the hill and he said, he asked me who was in charge, and I said I was, and he said, what's going on? And I said, well, there's some German tanks over there. And he said, let me have your glasses. Now, why he didn't have a pair of field glasses, I don't have the slightest idea. But he sort of took my glasses, and he got his head just above the oats or the wheat. And he looked over there, and for a few minutes he did not say a word. And then a few ladies would excuse me. He said, "Well, I'll be goddamn, they are German, aren't they?" And I can't.